Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Ramsey. I'm the Chief of Staff to Dr. Hayden here at the Library of Congress. And I want to welcome all of you to today's lecture. It's with some irony that I'll introduce the Library of Congress to you, since you all are so familiar with it. But I, with pride, want to repeat some things that we all know quite well. We are the world's largest library, this country's oldest federal cultural institution, and the 170 million items in our collection reflect our shared cultural heritage and also the histories well beyond our own borders. With collections in over 400 languages and formats ranging from the Gutenberg Bible printed on vellum to the sound recordings of lost Native American languages captured on wax cylinders to our born digital content of this century, we truly have a universal collection, and I hope that you all will continue to make use of it and preserve it. So today it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Lyman Tower Sargent to the Library of Congress for a lecture entitled African Americans in Utopia, Visions of a Better Life. But first I would like to recognize the library's own Dr. Sybil Moses and Leroy Bell for organizing this important event. Dr. Moses is a reference specialist for African American history and culture in the Researcher and Reference Services Division. Please join me now in thanking Dr. Moses as she comes forward to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ryan, for welcoming our guests, but also for your continuous support. One of the greatest joys that I have experienced as a reference librarian in the main reading room is the opportunity to interact with outstanding scholars from throughout this country and from all over the world. We frequently interact with these scholars as they use our collections to delve deeply and labor in areas previously unexplored, thereby creating new scholarship. And they share this information that is out in the bibliographic universe, unavailable or unknown to many of us. As a librarian working with scholars, we find that they broaden our horizons in our various subject areas, thereby enabling us to promote and better serve our users. These scholars also assist us in developing our collections and making information more discoverable. This is just what happened when Lyman Tower Sargent, who comes to conduct research at the Library of Congress every year, in between his lectures and fellowships in New Zealand, England, Portugal, and elsewhere. Professor Sargent has introduced me to several African American writers of utopian literature. One example is the late Carlton Shears, a Howard University graduate and physicist who wrote utopian and dystopian novels and also owned a publishing company here in the District of Columbia. Professor Sargent's work on African Americans and utopia is so intriguing to me that I approached him and asked that when he reached the point that he could share willing to share his information, if he would consider speaking with us at the Library of Congress. He emailed me right before departing to Portugal, and the wheels started turning. Thanks to my chief, Dr. Kimberly Bugg, we were able to push a proposal through in record time. Now, just a few notes about Dr. Sargent. Lyman Tower Sargent is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and a scholar of utopian studies. He has served as a visiting professor at several universities, and this list is not exhaustive, including the London School of Economics and Political Science and Victoria University of Wellington. He has also held positions as visiting fellow at Mansfield College, University of Oxford, and visiting research fellow at the Center for Political Ideologies in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. He was the founding editor of Utopian Studies from 1990 until 2004, and is the author or co-author of more than 15 books and over 100 articles. Works include Contemporary Political Ideologies, a comparative analysis, a work on utopianism, a very short introduction, utopian literature in English and annotated bibliography from 1516 to the present. He has also advised from 1997 until 2000 the Bibliothèque Nationale in France and the New York Public Library on their joint exhibit entitled Utopia, The Quest for the Ideal Society in the West, that was shown in Paris from April to July of 2000, and then in New York from October 2000 to 2001. I am extremely grateful to him. You don't know that as librarians, you know there's a lot of information out there in the universe, but it takes a scholar to bring it together and help us make sense of it. And one of his colleagues from Hood College just told us that people all over the world depend on Professor Sargent for his knowledge in utopian studies. So I welcome you to the Library of Congress, which is really your home, and invite you to share with us.
Thank you very much. Libraries really are my home. I mean, I can't really imagine a better life than spending your time in rare book rooms. They're really a delight. And I also have found that in talking to librarians, I often learn more than they do because they have a lot of information that when I ask a question, I've often had librarians coming up to me shortly after the talk saying, well, here's how you can find the answer. So I'd like to thank Sybil. I gave her much too little time on this. And I'd like to thank Hoda, who has read the long piece this is drawn from twice, and a friend, Tim Miller, who is the foremost expert on U.S. Intentional communities, who read the section, relatively little of which I'm going to talk about, on intentional communities. He also read it twice. So we, I think, all learned a lot in doing this. This is part of a larger project. I'm in the process of writing a book, or perhaps just a series of articles, on utopianism in the United States. I'm trying to combine chronological chapters with chapters that are thematic. And this is drawn from one of the thematic chapters. I started to try to write a chapter on race and discovered it was simply too big to do in even a long chapter. And so I decided I would focus on African Americans, and I started really with talking about how they were treated in the literature, and they decided that was going to make it much too big also. And so I narrowed it down to the way African Americans have themselves contributed to utopian literature and to intentional communities, which used to be called at one time utopian experiments, and then some other ways in which utopianism can be expressed. I call utopianism social dreaming. It's a way that people think about both good societies and what we call dystopias, bad societies. And then there are people who try to put these dreams into practice. And those are, in one stage, what we now scholars call intentional communities. You know, it's a small commune. And there are a lot of them. We know that in the United States today, there are at least 2,000 such communities. And there are a lot of them for various reasons who don't want to be known about. And we know of at least 250 to 500 of those that we know exist, but they're not for good reason on record. And there are a lot more African American ones that than I ever expected. throughout American history, African Americans have been kept from experiencing the most basic of utopias, which to me is a full stomach, decent clothing and housing, and a sense of security. Millions of people in the world obviously don't have those today, and systematically over the years in this country, African Americans have been kept from that. And so what I'm talking about is how they've responded by trying to envision a better life and, in many cases, try to put it into practice. Given the size of the subject, it's going to be simply an overview. I'm going to do it primarily chronologically. I've always say I'm simple-minded. I think that things follow in order chronologically, and that's a good way of beginning to try to understand something. But of course, themes do occur. For example, in what follows, there will be the desire, obviously, for freedom, land, education, and economic and physical security, with land somewhat less central today than in the past, and with security, while always a subtext, really coming to the fore in this century. But there's a lot of variety also. This is hardly surprising, but I think it's useful to have a reminder that African Americans should not be thought of as if they were all thought alike. And you run across that rather too often in the literature. Now, the first utopia so far identified, and I will say that sort of thing from time to time, because as Sybil pointed out, about a year and a half ago, I discovered an African-American author who no one knew anything about. And then I discovered that there were 8 or 9 books by the man, plus a record that no one can find a copy of. So in a number of places, I will say we just don't know yet. The first one was called Blake, or The Huts of America, from 1859, by a man named Martin Robeson Delaney, not all of which has survived, unfortunately. The last chapters, which were to be published, do not seem to exist, although one always hopes for somebody's attic or basement or some library that hadn't gotten around to cataloging something yet. The number of works I have found that suddenly appeared because somebody in some library had finally cataloged something really quite remarkable. In this book, it's really chapters that exist, includes insurrections failed and successful by slaves, and the published part of the novel ends with the results of a successful insurrection and the outlines of a nation of blacks, which is one of the most common themes in the literature and among the intentional community. Given the trajectory at the end of the novel, frustratingly, the lost chapters may have made the utopia much more explicit. The next 3 utopias are primarily religious. 2 were published in the immediate post-Civil War period, and the third in 1895. The first is called After Death by a man named Paschal Beverly Randolph, who is thought, and I will say, stress thought, to have founded the first U.S. Rosicrucian order. It's a detailed description of racially separate heavens. The second, The Rise and Progress of the Kingdoms of Light and Darkness by Lorenzo D. Blackson, is a Christian allegory reflecting the battle between good and evil on earth and in the celestial country from the creation onwards into the future where, as in all of these allegories, good wins. The third work is the first utopia so far discovered by an African-American woman. This is Four Girls in Cottage City from 1895 by Emma D. Kelley Hawkins. It's a sentimental novel where the utopia is presented, is used to present the afterlife as a means of encouraging the protagonists and the reader to lead a better life. In other words, it's a standard Christian allegory. Such religious works have a long history, and in the U.S. were particularly popular at the end of the 19th century. The first work by an African American that fits a narrow definition of utopia in that it describes a better society in this world is a relatively well-known one, Imperium in Imperio by Sutton E. Griggs, a Baptist minister who wrote extensively on the problems brought about by the failure of Reconstruction. In the novel, Griggs describes an African American government within the state of Texas that is modeled on the U.S. government with some structural changes. But he also wrote a second utopia that almost nobody seems to know about. It's part of a book, a novel called Unfettered, and within it there's a utopia called Dorland's Plan, where he presents a fictional proposal for solving racial problems in the United States. Unfortunately, it takes Dorland, who happens to be an extremely wealthy African-American man, which is rather unusual at the time, in 1902. He proposes to establish an organization that will enable his people to become fully equal citizens of the United States. And here, and in many of Griggs's other works, he argues that African Americans have to learn to work cooperatively rather than remaining divided against each other. And Griggs again and again and again emphasizes the conflict within the African American community and the way that has to end in order to be able to bring about a better society. At the beginning of the 20th century, 3 utopias by African Americans, 2 of them by women, were published. Pauline Hopkins was a prominent journalist, playwright, and novelist, and she published Of One Blood serially in the Colored American magazine between November 1902 and November 1903. It includes a hidden utopian city in Ethiopia that is based upon the best traditions of African civilization, and that is the basis of the utopia, is the traditions in Africa. The second one is the one by a man, is E.A. Johnson. He was born a slave and graduated from Atlanta University, where Hoda also graduated, studied and practiced law, and became the first African American elected to the New York State Legislature. He published Light Ahead for Negroes in 1904. The novel is set in 2006 in an improved but still segregated South, in which blacks and whites, and it says naturally, associate with their own people. But still, life is much better than in the past. And radically, the southern cotton plantations have been purchased, broken up, and resold to African Americans at low prices, with the buyers being given assistance and training. Thus, in his utopia, while the desire that slaves in the U.S. expressed for freedom, land, and education have been partially implemented, there's nothing like equality. And throughout the novel, the attitudes of whites to blacks is depicted in such a way that is so paternalistic that I keep thinking he means it as satire. It's not obvious that he means it as satire, but I can't get away from the notion as I read it that he means this to be read, at least satirically, by the African Americans, perhaps not by the whites. The next, also relatively well-known in, at least in utopian studies, published by a woman named Mrs. Lillian Bertha Jones. It's been recently reprinted, and I don't really understand although the book was written by Mrs. Lillian Bertha Jones, the reprint has added one of her married names. And so it is now published by Mrs. Lillian Bertha Jones Horace, which drives us bibliographers crazy. She was an author, educator, and a librarian. She earned a bachelor's degree from Simmons College in 1922 and a master's degree in Library of Science at the University of Chicago in 1940. She published 5 Generations Hence in 1916, so before she had her formal education. It's mostly concerned with relations between the races in the contemporary U.S., but it also includes a vision of a future Africa that is civilized and prosperous. Around the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois published 3 utopias between 1911 and 1928. Quest of a Silver Fleece, Dark Water, subtitled Voices from Within the Veil, and Dark Princes. Quest is mostly concerned with the mistreatment of African Americans in the South, but the protagonists, particularly a very feisty woman, outwit their main opponents. The book ends describing the beginnings of the development of a project that will include a school, a home for orphans, orphan girls, and an entire community providing a better life for its inhabitants. Dark Water is a collection of essays, poems, and short stories to culminate in a utopian story, in a utopia in the story The Comet, and the poem A Hymn to the Peoples, which these 2 pieces are what ends the book, in which the importance of racial differences disappear. Dark Princess is a much more complex novel that follows the life of a young African-American man who wants to be a doctor but can't because, as an African-American, and this was standard practice, he is not allowed to complete the required section in obstetrics. So that there were almost no hospital in the United States would allow a black man to do the obstetrics course, and thus eliminated the possibility of them being a doctor. He flees the country and meets other colored people who hope to create a united body to work for their betterment. For personal reasons, he rejects their overtures and returns to the United States, where he becomes an up-and-coming politician married to a wealthy, well-connected woman. But after numerous setbacks, he reconnects with a group who have a plan for a better future that will be developed over the coming 15 years. Though there is a disagreement, which Du Bois does not resolve within the novel, between those who believe in violence in bringing about the better society and those who reject it. Now, 15 years later, George S. Schuler published the first of 3 utopias, Black No More, under his own name, followed by the Black International and the Black Empire, both of which were published serially in the Pittsburgh Courier under the pseudonym Samuel I. Brooks. They've been republished by Northeastern University Press in Boston. The Pittsburgh Courier articles do not survive completely, and the people at Northeastern have reconstructed the serials from the notes that Schuler left, so that we have a quite coherent story, but how accurate all of it is, not absolutely certain. Schuler was an African-American journalist. He wrote a column for the Pittsburgh Couriers for 40 years and gradually became more and more conservative following these novels. He ends up quite a ways on the right. Black No More is concerned with the personal and social effects of a process to whiten black skin. There's been a number of works on that order. Passing as white and the advantages of lighter skin was a regular theme at the time, and Schuler also wrote a play about it. In the other two works, African American professionals formed the Black International to liberate Africa from white colonialism, including a level of violence comparable to that of the colonists. In the first work, The Black International, Schuler stresses the exceptional quality of the people involved and makes clear that not all blacks are as intelligent, the same point that Du Bois made with the talented tenth. In the Black Empire, the Black International is established in Liberia to carry out its mission of liberating Africa, and after Liberia is attacked by European forces, much of the novel is on the war, which the Black International wins and then establishes a utopia, much of which is concerned with producing a healthier population. Although the more I read this, more I'd like to see those things that are missing from the Pittsburgh Courier, because it ends up with the utopia being a pretty minor part of it. Although I'm certain that there's more material yet to be found, current research shows about a 30-year break before the next African American author turned to the utopian form. Then between 62 and 72, a period that included, the 63 assassination of Kennedy, the 65 assassination of Malcolm X, and the 68 assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy. 13 authors wrote dystopias about the current racial situation in the U.S. The first of these, William Kelley's A Different Drummer, is about an individual African American in the South, is a revolt against the system and its effects on others. In 65, Ronald Fair published Many Thousand Gone, an American fable, which is set in one dystopian county in Mississippi, created through the machinations of a corrupt lawyer and an equally corrupt judge, that really re-established slavery after the Civil War and continued to the end of the novel. When the federal government finally tries to bring change to the county, the federal marshals are thrown in jail. And at this point, the Negroes revolt, burn down the town, and kill most of their tormentors while saving the white women and children. The title, Many Thousand Gone, refers to the thousands of Negroes who had been killed by whites. These works were followed by John Oliver Killen's Sippy, about Mississippi, obviously. Sam Greenlee's The Spook Who Sat by the Door, Chester Himes' Plan B, John Williams' Sons of Light, Sons of Darkness, Chuck Stone's King Strut, Blyden Jackson's Operation Burning Candle, and John Edgar Whiteman's The Lynchers, all of which present various versions of Black Revolt. Parallel with these novels of resistance were a series of works presenting the ways in which blacks were suppressed or scenarios of future repression. Williams' The Man Who Cried I Am includes a plan to cordon off African Americans from the rest of the country. Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo is about a conspiracy of whites to destroy African American culture. The man that Sybil referred to and that I had discovered, Carl L. Shears, wrote Countdown to Black Genocide. It's a plot planning to kill all whites in the U.S. Shears also self-published, as I said, other novels, stories, poems, plays, most of which deal with the oppression of African Americans, including the establishment of concentration camps and genocide. And his last work was a play called I'm blanking, Sunshine People, in which the black genocide is repeated in the play but he prefaces it as a way in which he ends it with the possible establishment of a new black nation, and he had prefaced it with, "This is a play that I hope will help young black Africans to find hope will help young African Americans find something that they can do to help themselves." Then there's a period where we get more and more written in science fiction. Two well-known authors, Samuel R. Delany and Octavia E. Butler, wrote a lot of works. To one degree or another, most of Delany's works involve outsiders, minorities, and outcasts, ethnic, racial, and/or sexual. While he started with novels, I think Delany's stories are actually more important, and one of them, Star Pit, refers directly to white supremacy. It's set in a future of space exploration in which there's a psychological barrier that, except for a few who have found some psychological abnormalities that allow them to pass through, causes insanities in those who went further. And the story makes explicit connection between white supremacies and those who can pass the barrier. Then Delany's work gets very, very complicated. And the disagreements among interpreters on what Delany was doing in his work, Dahlgren, Triton, Stars in My Pockets Like Grains of Sand, it makes it very difficult to know what to say. And Stars in My Pocket was supposed to have a sequel called The Splendor and Misery of Bodies of Cities that he never has written. But the title of Stars in My Pocket suggests the setting, a huge galaxy with over 6,000 worlds inhabited by fundamentally different intelligent beings. And the novel illustrates both the acceptance and rejections of such differences can produce, from cross-cultural love to extreme bigotry. While there are many individual utopias and dystopias among the cultures and worlds, the basic utopia in the novel centers on the acceptance of the almost incomprehensible variety that intelligence can take. Now, Butler said she didn't really believe in utopia. And most of what she wrote can be read either in dystopian terms or in questioning utopia. Butler's first utopia was written, it's called Childfinder. It was actually written in the 1970s, but it was accepted for in the never published book Last Dangerous Visions. And it was only published in an ebook in 2014. So her first story is published years after her death for the first time. In it, she suggests that telepathy could put humans on the road to utopia, but she says racial prejudice gets in the way and it fails. Her first published dystopia, Kindred, presents slavery as the dystopia it so obviously was through a slave narrative written by a woman who lives simultaneously in the past and the present. Probably her most anthologized story, Speech Sounds, she deals with race indirectly. It's a story about the suppression of a group, and it's been most often read as concerning women. And I think that's probably why it's been most anthologized. Not because it was about race, but because it was about women. But if you read the story, it's not about women. It's about any group, and it should be read, I think, as concerning race or gender, or most likely race and gender. She was, after all, an African-American woman. And so I think that this story has been read incorrectly. And then she did 3 large books called her Xenogenesis Trilogy, which is very wide-ranging with many themes and possible interpretations, and takes place after most humans have been killed in a nuclear war that left the Earth uninhabitable, and the few humans left have been rescued by aliens. Given the differences of power, one interpretation sees the situation of the remaining humans, some of whom are African American, as slavery, which is how some, but not all humans in the novel see it. And then in the 1990s, Butler published 2 volumes of an intended trilogy, Parable of the Sowers and Parables of the Talents, that start in a dystopia of complete governmental collapse and extends into the development of a new religion and a new community, Earthseed, which is led by a young African-American woman. But the 3rd volume, that might have been a positive utopia, was never written. She developed a massive writer's block, and she could not write. And the fragments that exist are held by the Huntington Library. So they are there and available for anybody to try to work with them, but they are fragments. There's nothing coherent. I haven't seen them, but I've read a very detailed analysis of what's there. It's very sad. The closest that Butler came to writing a positive utopia was Martha's book, published in 2003 in the online site scifiction.com, which no longer exists, and reprinted the only place you can find it now is in the 2nd edition of her book, Bloodchild. It's not in the 1st edition. In an afterword, she calls this her utopia story, adding that she always felt that one person's utopia would be another's hell. So individual utopias are created in each person's dreams, but only there. In the 1990s was a period of intense racial conflict, and there was a resurgence of explicit depictions of attacks on and attacks on U.S. racism by African American authors. Joel Gomez's Gilda stories, most of which are set in the past, includes 2 that are set in the future, both of which are the future is devastated by climate change, and in which any outsider remains at risk. And Gilda is African American, a lesbian, and a vampire, so she's about as far outsider as you can get. And then in 1998, a further Gilda story, Houston, she insists it's pronounced as the street in New York rather than in the city, is set further in the same future. In 1992, I think one of the most powerful stories was published, The Space Traders by Derrick Bell. He was the first African-American professor of law at Harvard University. In the story, aliens visiting the U.S. offer enough gold to bail out the country, chemicals that can unpollute the environment, safe nuclear energy, and enough fuel to overcome the energy crisis in exchange for the entire African American population. The government agrees, and all African Americans are loaded onto what are obviously slave ships. There's one nice little positive utopia by an African American in the 1990s, but it was written for children. It's called My Visit to Xanadu by the historian John Hope Franklin. It's published in a book called Xanadu, The Imaginary Place, and is accompanied by stories and poems and illustrations of Xanadu by the children. It's a delightful book. I think I'm even going to have to skip more than I had intended to skip in order to get more done. So let me tell you something about what's going on right now. Oh, there's one other great story that I think is one of the most powerful satires that I've read. It's by a woman named Tana Hargest. It's called Bitter Nigger Incorporated. That's the name of a company that sells, among other products, Tominex, the go-along-to-get-along medication, said to be, quote, the only over-the-counter medication to remove your yearnings for fairness or human decency. It's a beautifully done satire. There have been some positive works published recently. Alexis Pauline Gumb's Evidence from 2015 is set in a future utopia in which everyone is encouraged to develop in their own unique way, but it looks back to a dystopia that existed before the period called Before Silence Broke. Since she is an African-American woman and a gay rights activist, just what constitutes breaking the silence has more than one dimension. Nissi Shaw's Everfire presents a flawed multiracial utopia in Africa during the period of the Congo, and she's got a sequel called The Kinning just about to come out. So we'll find out where that goes. Walter Mosley wrote a book called Folding the Red into the Black. It's a detailed nonfiction utopia based on the melding of capitalism and socialism. There are, of course, many negative ones, dystopias. Danya Reeves' Othello Pop is a brief vignette set at a racist dystopia in which it is illegal to educate anyone not white, which of course was the practice under slavery, and yellow girls are supposed to be killed at birth. So again, that theme is still being talked about. It's hardly surprising that most of the recent work is dystopian, but in order to have questions, I'm going to just say a couple words about intentional communities. First, intentional communities in the U.S. have been overwhelmingly white, but from very early on, there were individual black members of such communities. The Shaker communities, which are probably one of the best known communities, many of them had African American members, and in some cases, they purchased slaves and freed them. And there was one urban Shaker community in Philadelphia which was black. Also, Sojourner Truth, who you may have heard of, joined or was affiliated with 4 different communities. So she lived in, we know she lived in at least 2, and her name is connected with 2 others. I will mention one other that's really very interesting. This was founded by a white man, man named Joseph Davis, who happens to have been the brother of a man named Jefferson Davis. He founded it in Mississippi Bend on the Mississippi River. He allowed his slaves a measure of self-government, including a court in which slaves tried other slaves. After the war, and no one, including an overseer, could punish any slave except with the approval of the court of the slaves. This is Jefferson Davis's brother. And it says in the one study that Jefferson Davis's own plantation worked on the same principles. But that's all it says. There's no documentation. He sold his land to the slaves after the war. Unfortunately, he died and a hurricane took out the settlement and they couldn't make the payments and his descendants took the land back. But the descendants of the slaves founded another community called Mound Bayou further north on, in Mississippi. The first two communities founded after the Civil War, though, are really quite interesting. The Kingdom of the Happy Land in the mountains on the border between North and South Carolina originated in 1864 or 1865 and lasted until about 1900. About the same time, the Coe Ridge community was established in the mountains on the Kentucky-Tennessee border and lasted until into the 1950s. We have only oral history on both of them. Shows you just how important oral history is, but God, I wish we had some documentation. But the length of those communities is remarkable. Most such communities are very short-lived. I'm going to skip over a whole movement called the Exodusters, which is founding communities mostly in Kansas and Oklahoma during the Reconstruction period as the South was reestablishing slavery as tenant farming and sharecropping. The African American population in those two states went up by thousands. If you might remember that Kansas is where Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka came from, so that it was African Americans, descendants of the Exodusters, who brought about that. I will end with one community that's just coming into existence. It's called Soulfire Farm. It exists on the around Albany, New York. It's going through the process from being moved from a family farm owned by an African American couple into a community. It's on degraded land that, as the woman who founded the farm said, was stolen from the indigenous population, which is perfectly correct. And what they're doing is they're teaching African Americans, the local Native American Indians, and the Asian from the area how to farm. They have taken the degraded land and made it livable. They're growing crops very successfully, and they're educating these. They've extended this into New York City to train African Americans by bringing particularly children out to the farm to have them learn about agriculture and farming and growing your own food. They have also extended it into Haiti and Africa. The woman who founded this thing, Leah Pennington, is obviously quite a woman. And there's a book that she has just published on Soulfire Farm. To me, this shows what's possible. It's just in process, it's just starting, but it so far has had an immense amount of success, and it's just beginning to get recognized. The one other thing you can say about communities is that since one of the attributes of many intentional communities is they want to practice their beliefs without interference. There are probably more African American communities that are little known or unknown. And particularly early in this century, when safety had to be a major concern, they would want to keep their heads down. Quite simply, if no one knew of your existence, you were more likely to survive. Much has been written about the success or failure of intentional communities, a lot of it based on longevity as the measure of success. But most members of communities think longevity is not a very good measure. It's how well it fulfilled their needs during the time that they lived there. It appears that some African American communities met the older longevity test, and that many have met or are currently meeting the standard of fulfilling the current needs of their members, so that you can see them as success. Here I've tried to pull together an important history that's been forgotten, neglected, and willfully ignored. A people's hopes and fears reflect their identity, are part of their heritage, which should be known and not forgotten, because it helps define who they are and who they could be. What African Americans have wanted and struggled for 3 centuries for is a chance to have the life that many others consider their birthright. Once achieved, the next generation wants more or different. But this is the way utopia works. Thank you. Well, there's not much time, but I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody might have, or comments, or brickbats, or whatever. Yes.
Good afternoon. First of all, sincerely, as an African-American woman, thank you for this work. Most of African-Americans that I know of are working towards the utopian side of this complex ordeal. My question, in essence of time, would be how did commerce and your findings play a role in us not being able to achieve that?
Could you repeat what she said?
Well, I missed the key word.
Commerce. How does commerce play in?
I once heard John Rawls give a speech in which he answered every question. That's a very good question. I'll have to think about it. And then 5 years later, he wrote a book that answered all the questions. But I mean, historically, African Americans have simply been kept down. The fact that they have, I lived in St. Louis for a long time, and St. Louis had a very, very successful black community. So what happened? Main interstate highways were driven directly through the black communities and destroyed them. That happened in most major cities. Government policy, there's a whole section of that I have on a number of African American communities where white farmers got grants, black farmers didn't. It was official policy. Loans that were given for white businesses were not given to black businesses. This is some of the most depressing stuff that one can work through, because there are positive notes in which periods, there were periods of civil rights acts right after the Civil War because the new amendments weren't being enforced. And the Supreme Court, of course, interpreted the 14th Amendment as not applying to what the legislators who passed it said it applied to. They said it only applied to commerce. It did not apply to individual relations. Whereas anyone reading any of the legislative history means that it was precisely the reverse that was intended. Again and again, we had civil rights acts because the law was not being enforced, and then the new civil rights acts were ignored. So government policy, businesses that ignored African Americans or well, I mean, in the South, they, you know, the whole attempts to re-enslave through, as I said, sharecropping and tenant farming. The movement to the South, where it then became cheaper to pay blacks than to pay whites, so that they did get jobs in the North, but they took a long time before they could be at all successful. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
One could go on, of course. Yes.
My father was born and raised in Mount Bayou.
Oh, wonderful.
So when you mentioned that, I was stunned. And all I've ever known about it was that it was an all-black town. It does not look prosperous now, to my eyes, when you go there.
It was extremely prosperous for a while after its founding. There was a major controversy in that the son or grandson, I can't remember, of the slave who was trying to develop the one on the Mississippi Bend, who was one of the founders of the Mound Bayou, was a delegate to the Mississippi Convention that took the vote away from blacks, and he voted for it. Frederick Douglass had a few words for him. But it was extremely prosperous, but it also was very authoritarian, because they wanted a clean town. And if you weren't their sort of black, you were requested to leave. All prostitutes were put on the train out of town. If anybody put them up, the people putting them up were driven out of town. It has a very interesting history. There is a book on it. It's on the whole series. It's by a woman Davis. Can you remember? I think you put it on the list of the bibliography that's in there. But it's called. It's not a woman named Davis. It's a woman named Hernan, something like that.
Oh, Janet Herman.
Janet Herman. Is that the one?
The Pursuit of a Dream is actually on display outside.
Okay, so there's a book on the history and on Mound Bayou. Now, it's the only book, so there's a lot more work for somebody to do. It's always interesting who you find in audiences. Yeah, give you back some of your history. Yes.
I just wondered if you would care to comment on seeing Black Panther as an African-American utopian vision.
I have a whole section that I didn't talk about on that. The Black Panthers founded intentional communities in Oakland, quite successful, although they had a lack of success in their stated purpose of gender equality in their community. But Bobby Seale wrote an essay on the ideal community, which stressed education. And I mean, the Panthers, they ran soup kitchens, they ran schools. In the black community, they were often the only people doing this sort of thing for the poor people at times. What they're remembered for is the violence and the confrontations with the government and they're being massacred, I think is an accurate word. But in many black communities, they were very, very welcome, and they were providing services that you could not get any other way. So I think we really need, there is some good work being done recently. There's a woman who's recently published a book on being a woman in the Black Panthers and in these communities. And she's very, very blunt about the problems, but she's also very clear on the positive effects that the Panthers had. I think, that unfortunately, the history's been written by the whites. And, I'm white. I'm always nervous about giving papers. I once said while I was talking about gender issues that I was nervous about it, and somebody in the audience said, "You can say what we want, we may or may not listen to you." But I think I've found things here and in the gender area that people haven't put together. It's out there, but bringing it together gives you a very, very different picture of the experience. There was another question.
Just a comment. What I thought I heard was Black Panther, the movie. So
Oh, ha 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 ha. Ha ha ha.
Thank you for a fascinating answer.
He made me stay away from that. He said, "No, I'm not talking about film."
I'm not a film. Reading a film is a very, very different thing than reading a book. Film theorists get really pissed off at people who think they can read a film in the way they can read a book. So I'm the main bibliography. Well, the first thing on your bibliography is my bibliography. There are 9,700 entries at the moment. I don't have time to do film, although there are references to film when a book has been made into a film. Yes.
So just an aside, I've done some research on the MOVE organization in Philadelphia, which I think is
I've got a section on that too.
between utopian and dystopian communities.
Sure.
The question I wanted to ask you is to go back to your larger pulling together the written utopias and the intentional communities. Since you've also studied that movement in the United States more generally, from what I studied in the past, I know that a lot of utopias come from sort of religious foundations, some of the written ones. But then the intentional communities may often be belief-based, but not necessarily coming from organized religion or from established religion. What I was wondering is, since we so much associate African Americans with religion in the United States, if you see any similarities or differences between the primarily African American expressions and the larger sort of overall American expressions.
Well, in intentional communities, overwhelmingly the communities are religious. There are exceptions. And there are ones that we don't know whether they ever quite became a community. There was a movement for the Republic of New Africa at one time that went into the South to buy land to form a community, but we have no records of what happened. Everybody thought they had simply disappeared. But when one of the founders died, there was suddenly people from the Republic of New Africa at the funeral. Now, nobody was there to interview them, unfortunately, but today, most of the intentional communities are Islamic. And they're being attacked for that. There's a very successful community in upstate New York that recently has been in the press because they've been attacked by outsiders, whereas the state police and the sheriffs say this is probably the safest and most law-abiding community in our entire area. But they're being attacked by whites for being Islam. Okay, I mean, I can talk forever, but that's